Overall economy has had much to do with the poor lumber markets we're experiencing today, but the reduction in timber harvest was also occurring even when we had experienced very strong demand for lumber. Much of the drop is attributable to the fall-off in federal timber, about a 90% reduction on those lands, but also during this period, however, during that period, the private land harvest dropped by 63%. California's complex regulatory mechanisms and the high cost of implementing them have driven many landowners to stop harvesting timber. In many cases, they're converting these lands to other uses such as vineyards. Indeed, 2 large wineries in Sonoma County recently announced that they plan to convert 2,000 acres of redwood and Douglas fir land to grapes rather than timber. Other landowners are finding that they're not converting, but they just cannot afford to do a timber harvest plan relative to the value of the lumber they're going to get out of it on the other end. California is blessed with an abundance of renewable timber resources. Yet, the state finds itself importing a vast majority of the lumber that it demands. A UC Davis study published in 2003 found that California imported anywhere from 5 to 50% of its lumber needed in the state between 1990 and 1999. Using that same methodology and applying it to the years 2000 to 2009, the trend increases to where now 70 to 85% of the lumber consumed in this state is imported. We expect the trend is going to continue if California starts building new homes again. Ironically, timber harvests are only a fraction of what is growing here, resulting in fuel buildups that heighten the conditions for catastrophic wildfires. According to the U.S. Forest Service, growth exceeds harvest by a factor of 7 across all ownerships in California. So we're growing 7 times more timber volume than we're harvesting.
Is that in the state of California, both on private and federal land?
Across all ownerships.
Thank you.
We operate in California and Washington State. Running manufacturing operations and the cost for preparing environmental documents for timber harvesting are dramatically higher in California than they are in Washington. For example, our cost of preparing a THP in California is around $40,500 for our company, and we pay filing fees that are approximately $5,000 to the state for each plan. This includes a $965 fee we pay to Department of Fish and Game for their review. Conversely, our cost for preparing a plan in Washington is about $6,000, and we pay the state $50 for the review of that plan. So overall, the costs in California are about 7.5 times greater than they are in Washington for producing the environmental document. The state's multidisciplinary approach to timber harvesting plan review has resulted in extremely high costs for the number of plans reviewed. For example, in 1997, there were 1,000 plans submitted in the state. In 2010, there were 250 plans. The cost went from $10 million in 1997 to $19 million in the 2010-2011 fiscal year. The increase in cost is not consistent with the decrease in workload and reflects an approach of doing business that is no longer compatible with today's needs. We have suggested an approach that calls for a centralized THP clearinghouse and streamlining reviews by assembling teams that are fully focused on THP review and operate under a contract with the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And that certainly has an issue that's been discussed here today. We think this would result in a more efficient review and considerable savings to the state, and we'd be pleased to discuss that in greater detail. In summary, as I stated at the beginning, we are pleased that the committee is examining these issues. We embrace the state's goals for protecting public trust resources, and we make significant investments each year to assure that we are helping to further those goals. However, the forest products industry in California is struggling to survive in difficult markets, and relief is needed. We've identified mechanisms that can provide cost savings to the state and to private landowners without reducing environmental protections. We hope the legislature and the administration will give serious consideration to our recommendations, and I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Again, between the two of you, whoever would like to go next.
Chairman, members of the committee, I do have specific recommendations to address the issues that have been brought up today, but in order to stay under 5 minutes, I'll stay with my written remarks.
That's fine, and if you would introduce yourself, that would help.
My name is Jim Little. I'm a small forest landowner, a registered professional forester, and the Vice President of the Forest Landowners of California. Our organization was formed in 1975 to represent the families that own nearly half of the privately held timberland in California. The 400 members of the forest landowners have over 250,000 forested acres in California. This includes forest landowners with less than 10 acres, and one of our landowner members has over 50,000 acres. The vast majority of our members have less than 1,000 acres, with an average ownership of approximately 150 acres. Our membership is a representative cross-section of the non-industrial forest landowners in California. Most of our members see their properties as long-term investments that are utilized to fund everything from college educations to retirement. I understand that today's committee hearing is interested in understanding the relationships of forest regulation, the cost of regulation, and how to properly fund these costs. Generally speaking, our membership believes that they are faced with overly burdensome range of regulations. They also believe that they are burdened with regulatory costs that are excessive and a disincentive to good forest stewardship. This is not to say that our membership is opposed to regulation. We recognize that as forest landowners, we have a responsibility to protect the values that are associated with healthy forests. We also understand that because of the important role forests play in the environment and the values they add to society, it is necessary for society to ensure that these values are being protected. However, as clearly illuminated in the time-worn phrase, "Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater," we shouldn't regulate the small landowner into extinction, nor should we continue to raise the cost of timberland ownership to the point that small ownerships are consolidated into entities that by their nature cannot provide all the associated social and environmental values. As a preparer of timber harvest plans, I have seen many small properties where it has become economically or operationally unfeasible to harvest because of the present system of forest regulation. Just as significant, I have seen many landowners choose not to harvest because of the significant costs and the uncertainty of the return on the investment of those costs. The net result is that the non-industrial forest landowner is paying a significant cost for the protection of the forest environment, and they are contributing, without cost to the public, many of the values that society sees as fundamentally important. The forest landowners of California do not expect, nor do they ask, for a reversal of the level of environmental protection we have all come to recognize as emblematic of our values. We do, however, believe that the present system is overburdensome, excessively costly, exceedingly complicated, and often counterproductive. In addition, the California system places our landowners at a decided disadvantage to other timber-producing regions. It is our opinion that the present system encourages conflict at the expense of collaborative efforts to ensure that the environment is protected while providing the landowners the means to reach their personal goals. We believe that we can work with all the stakeholders and play a critical role in reviving the economies of our rural communities while continuing to provide the world's standard for environmental protection. To do this, we believe we must accomplish four main objectives: reduce the cost of regulation, encourage investment in resource restoration, protect and enhance the forest infrastructure, and ensure that environmental values are protected. These objectives are achievable. The risk, of course, is that the new policies will be driven solely by current conditions. Without thoughtful consideration, today's economic crisis could turn to tomorrow's environmental problem. History is cluttered with unintended consequences of short-term solutions to long-term problems. Adding to the cost of forest land ownership, especially for small landowners, will not achieve any of the intended benefits that will surely diminish the opportunity to balance environmental protection with economic stability. We know that there have been recommendations that the landowners bear more of the cost associated with the regulation of forest practices. We hope that this committee will recognize that the small forest landowner carries a disproportional burden. We bear the expense of this significant loss of value of our properties. We bear the expense of the tangled web of regulations, and we bear the costs of forest restoration. We have done all of these while providing the citizens of this state the unique and important values that sustains our communities and provides for a healthy environment. We look forward to working with this committee and the legislature in formulating a new path that leads to cost-effective regulation that encourages responsible forest stewardship and supports economic growth in our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Little. Danny.
Mr. Chairman, other members, Mike Janai, and I am representing Humboldt Redwood Company and Mendocino Redwood Company here today. Both of them are family-run businesses. We own about 430,000 acres of redwood timberland in Northern California, Humboldt County, Mendocino County, and some in Sonoma County, with 2 sawmills that work 1 shift at each mill. I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you today. I have been in the business in the Redwood region for over 36 years, and at least 20 of those I've spent trying to resolve this issue that we're talking about today. And hopefully something will come from these discussions today and we will move forward. It isn't just a simple matter of looking at the cost of what a THP costs to put together or what it costs to review. To manage a forest such as ours, and even small landowners as well, the costs are much more extensive than the numbers that have been thrown around today. Outside of our log and haul, which is a very labor-intense part of our business, within our 2 businesses, we incur over $15 million of expense each year that cover things like wages and benefits for our employees within our forestry division, forest scientists, costs related to road maintenance and restoration work, and costs for paying consultants to do outside survey work like owl calling or geological reviews. At least 90% of that $15 million is directly attributable to the protection of public trust resources. 90%. And Mr. Chairman, we do that to avoid the need for environmental cleanup. All of those protection measures go towards clean water, clean air, wildlife protection, and fisheries enhancement. Every bit of that money. And if we don't do it, as Wesley pointed out, it won't get done. The state does not have the resources to do the work that we're doing on private lands. You add to that another $1 million that we spend on reforestation. Now, granted, we're in the business of growing trees, but part of that money, as we spend money to plant trees, goes for habitat enhancement. We have spent and changed 60,000 acres of timberland that were degraded in the past century, and we've brought those back into production. That means better wildlife habitat as well. We have controlled over 1 million cubic yards of sediment and kept it from entering the state's streams. We've reduced our harvest on our lands so that the land can produce more in the long term. And we've taken out thousands of barriers to fish migration. All of this at great cost. These actions are in the best interest of the state of California, and they take a lot of money. They also save the state money. All of the work that we do in putting together a THP is done specifically to create great detail, which then facilitates the agency's ability to look at what we're doing and know what is going to go on within that THP. We're good stewards of the land. We've gone to great lengths to earn the social license to manage timberlands in this state. Again, I say that comes at considerable expense. At times, the return on our the cash flow return has been very small on our properties, and at times it's even been non-existent. Today on the North Coast, you cannot harvest a Douglas fir tree, pay for the permits, and get it out of the woods for what you can sell it for at the sawmill, and that sawmill can afford to buy it, turn it into lumber, and compete with other outside lumber coming into the state. The rising cost of regulation could even render the higher value redwood uneconomic if we don't make some changes to the process. Policies and increased fees that result in land being uneconomic to operate will only result in the loss of high-paying jobs in rural areas, the inability to fund restoration projects, and then also the exportation of negative environmental consequences to other areas that don't have the kind of protection that we have in the state. I just want to end by saying I think we come here today to solve a problem. And one thought that occurs to me is that we looked at the forest practice rules. None of us are here advocating for the rules to be any lessened. But why not take a look at the rules and let us go out and implement those and spend less time up front reviewing what it is we're going to do and spend more time at the end seeing to it that we actually followed the rules. Because that's what we do. We follow the rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Janae, and I apologize for mispronouncing.
Everybody does. Don't worry about it.
Your name. We need an accent. Thank you all three for your comments, and I and perhaps others have a number of questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to forgo most of my questions, but one I did have that I wanted to ask. Since most of the companies, if not all those companies that are operating today are closely held corporations or family-owned businesses, unincorporated, there's not a lot of public data about what goes on from a financial standpoint, and that's perfectly legal and fine. But it does complicate assessing what costs and revenues and all the elements of financial operations are that comes along with being a publicly held company. My question is simply this: one of the important considerations, at least from my point of view, is the cost of regulation as a percentage of operating costs in general. And I'm not going to ask you to tell me what those are today, but I would ask whether you are willing to work with the committee staff and members of the legislature in looking at questions like that, so that we can get a better idea of what the costs and burdens are, and what the fair and reasonable allocation of costs to the public and the industry are as we try to pursue this subject.
Happy to do that.
We can get back to you on that, sure.
Okay. Mr. Little?
There's an expression, you never ask a cattleman how many cows he has. But I'm sure the forest landowners would be more than happy to provide the data that shows that the costs are a burden. So we would be more than happy to share that data.
I'm sure that's true. I'm just actually looking for the real costs.
The actual costs we can provide.
Okay. With that, as I say, I'm going to forgo my other questions. Mr. Chesbro.
Just one quick question. You may have heard me in my opening remarks refer to the possibility of some kind of working group to address the fee question and the alternative to solving the budget problem from a fee standpoint. Is there an interest on the part of forest landowners in participating in that kind of a conversation?
Yes, it's a great first step. We appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. Chairman Dickinson, I did provide as much information I could to your staff member. Also, in my testimony, I used a number that is absolutely the truth. The 90% cost of that $15 million is a real number. And we can draw lines directly back to that book of regulations and the process.
Yeah, that's fine. I had no implication by my question.
I wanted to make sure that you understood that. Thank you.
Okay. I think it's a much more detailed discussion.
Yes,
frankly.
it is. It's complex.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Garrick, did you have a
Yes,
question?
just a couple questions. Knowing that time and time value of money, I was concerned about the timber harvest plans specifically and how long it's taking in California versus Oregon or Washington, two of our competitive or competing states to supply lumber. I know and have an uncle who lives in Port Ludlow up in Washington, the Puget Sound. I've visited him many times, and I see ships departing from there headed to California full of timber. and that means that we're losing jobs and market share in this environment, as tough as it already is for home builders, construction, and for those carpenters and families that depend on it. So what is the time that it takes on a relative basis for California for a timber harvest permit or its equivalent in other states, those being Oregon and Washington? Can anyone comment on those?
I have some information on that since we do operate in Washington as well as California. In California, we take about 6 months roughly to do a timber harvest plan on our end, and then it takes roughly 5 to 6 months for the state to approve it. And that's the $40,000 that I had mentioned that it costs us to do. In Washington, it takes about 2 weeks for us to prepare a plan, and it takes only a couple of weeks for them to review it as well, I believe.
Anyone else care to comment? Any other people?
Yeah, those numbers are consistent with what small landowners see. It can be 6 months, it can be a year, and you should compare that with the fact that the actual logging window is only 3 or 4 months. So where it takes you 6 months to get the plan, because of the restrictions in the rules, the landowners only have a 3 or 4 month window that they can actually operate.
And that's much like any crop in terms of harvesting it, in terms of the window that you have to harvest it. Also, there's market windows that you may miss as far as prices of market and or demands.
The market windows are critical for small landowners. They only get one shot at the pie, and if they miss it through the process, it could be years before the market comes back to where they can afford to sell their trees.
What type of delays, since I know there's a statutory requirement of a 30 to 40-day turnaround by CAL FIRE, are you experiencing, or your members, particularly some of the small ones, that are delaying jobs and getting the product to market?
Well, unfortunately, we're at the mercy of the agencies, and they most often do not adhere to the statutory requirements for time. But the ultimate goal is to get an approved harvest plan, so you agree to the extensions that are asked to the statutory times in order to ultimately get that plan that you've already expended a significant amount of money to prepare.
Interesting negotiation position to be in when someone else holds all the cards, or at least the ones you want to play with. What are we talking about in terms of loss of jobs over the past 10 and 20 years in the timber industry, and what do you foresee in the near future? That's jobs are very important to all of us here, both sides of the aisle, and wanted to hear what the historic perspective, and from the 400 members with as small as 10 acres to 400,000 acre members.
I don't have the specific job numbers. I mean, 80 sawmills have closed since 1990. You know, if you got
80 mills,
80 sawmills, roughly 150 people at each mill. Typically.
That's out of 117 sawmills total in.
There are roughly 35 left, I think, something in that arena. So, you know, you had a significant drop, and then but each sawmill job, you know, it creates at least 2 other jobs. So, you know, you have the
multiplier effect. Yeah, and then you also have the community impact, I would think, from just the revenue generated in terms of the loss for education institutions, hospitals, and other service industries in those small communities that would be subject to loss of revenue or loss of jobs in their community, leading to loss of revenue for the businesses. Thank you again. I guess in closing, because I have a time limit, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, as I shared with you of 12:30, that I was going to close and just say that I appreciate you putting this together. The information was both insightful and also stimulating as it relates to some action I think we need to take on certain items, as I've expressed, the extension of some of the timber harvest permits and some of the other items for more cooperation. I heard of a lot of offers for cooperation, as I'm sure you did, to work collaboratively. But I'd love to see that move forward, and would hope that we are able to work, as Senator Chesbro, now Assemblyman, has suggested, that we have a working group put together. You offered that, did you not, to lead that or to be a part of it?
I just thought of as a suggestion.
And hope that we can help save an industry in California and keep it for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nielsen.
Gentlemen, how many years have you heard these observations about collaboration, expedited, one-stop shopping. How many years of hearings
20.
and a lip service has been paid to this? How many bills did you come here to oppose that made it more onerous a process? Am I wrong?
No.
Am I pointing the finger to this building? The legislators contribute probably more than the bureaucracy. And it's us that needs to do something about it. And a good example of lip service was this widely touted regulatory reform legislation of about a month ago, which is nice, and it makes you feel good, and it'll do a little bit. The ultimate impact will be Pyrrhic. And I was called off the floor to be interviewed about it, this wonderful advance in regulatory reform. And I said, it's all right, it's worth a yes vote. Better than nothing, but not much. But that's not the issue. This bill is inconsequent. While I'm being interviewed here, out on the floor are two other bills, one on call and one being debated, that are going to destroy thousands of jobs in California. And you're talking to me about regulatory reform? I think my point, gentlemen, I don't have any confidence that there's a resolve in this building to do anything. And I'm disappointed. And I think I see that disappointment in you here today. I do hope that this hearing, unlike most others, does result in some very serious conclusions. And I'd like your observation as to this. What would collaboration mean to you? What would your vision, if Ledge Analyst's recommendation, I've asked him to put some meat on the bone, what would that look like that you think would be meaningful?
Well, I can start. The way a THP review goes now, it's kind of a stovepipe thing where each department, each agency, reviews plans from their own perspective. We would submit that a better approach would be to assemble teams of people from each agency, each department that come together and they're focused solely on timber harvest plan review. They don't do other things during the day. They're just focused on that. And that way, we know what their budget is for that process. They're managed under the leadership of the department, the lead agency, the Department of Forestry. And I think there are mechanisms in there that could be explored. That it's sort of this team concept, where right now you have someone from the Water Board in Santa Rosa has to drive all the way up to Modoc County to review a timber harvest plan. It just doesn't make any sense to us. We think that there are just better ways to do that, and those are the kind of things that we would hope that this review group would explore.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, Jim.
The Department of Forestry is very familiar with the incident command system. And the incident command system means there's one commander. There's one person responsible. And he has the responsibility to find the expertise to solve the problem that they're facing, whether it's a major fire, whether it's some kind of an event, whether it's an earthquake or whatever. But there's one person responsible. And that's the way forest practice should be run, where the lead agency is really the lead agency. They are responsible for implementing the program, ensuring there's compliance, and ensuring that the other agencies have the opportunity to provide the proper input. But ultimately, it comes back to that one incident commander who makes the decision, go or no go.
I like that idea. Yeah. Forces accountability when you have one place to go to instead of a dispersed.
Senator Lamalfa.
Thank you again for your indulgence. I wanted to probably, Mr. Janai, with part of your presentation there, it sounds to me like not much credit is given to the positives that the industry provides. Not we'll put aside the jobs and having actual wood, but in the forest practices themselves. When we're talking about an unmanaged forest soon becomes an overcrowded forest. An overcrowded forest in your dry areas especially competes for limited water supply. The trees become more vulnerable to bug infestations and dying, and soon you have a whole tinderbox. And so I haven't heard a lot of emphasis on the positive benefits of having people being out there in the forest doing things, managing forest. You don't hear much about that. You just hear, it's bad to have roads, it's bad to have tree cutting, we need to, whatever. So does it seem that more credit needs to be given for the cost the state is avoiding from fire, from because you have managed forests that are easier to put out, from roads that people do put out there, installed properly, provide access for firefighters, and we could even get into the recreational aspect of these are our public lands, and I would affirm that the public is now getting less value out of our forests than ever before, having them gated off. The management what's your view on the value aspect of what is the public receiving now from their public lands, and as well as what timber people provide out there in the safety of the forest or et cetera versus doing nothing?
I think today that people are recognizing the good that is going on private timberlands. What the point I made about how complex it is to draw the lines back to the work that our folks do out on the forest for the protection of public trust resources is just exactly that. When we're talking about fees, and I'm telling you all that we're doing, to take that and dissect it in the day-to-day life of an organization like ours is doable, but it's extremely complicated. But again, I think you will see that there is a large benefit to be had by the state of California by us being on the ground, doing the work. I just wish we could spend more time on the ground doing the work versus in an office at a computer screen putting together these documents that then the state has to go pull apart, look at, and spend a lot of time at a desk in an office looking at it instead of out in the woods looking at performance.
Okay.
And Mr. Little's comment to that too, I think I wholeheartedly agree with, is that let's spend the time with the teams. Even Mr. Palicki talked about the teams, but have the teams work together to develop the criteria, the template you can use one time and apply to all the different harvest plans, and just provide that oversight and make sure these agencies are checking in with hold themselves accountable, and entrust the power to one in that chain of command. I really appreciate that comment. So, but your story needs to be much louder about the value you provide. We get hung up on what the fees or cost to the state. What's the cost of the state of doing nothing? What's the cost of the state of having unmanaged timberlands? We talked about private lands, but also the benefit to what state properties you have, and certainly the federal properties, of that are largely unmanaged. And when you have a fire, for example, that goes through and hits the checkerboard of all different types of properties, see who's planning back the soonest these burned lands. The private folks are right on top of it. The state might be doing pretty good. The feds, they still got the same snags out there 15 years later that are a tinderbox.
Well, Senator, with all due respect, I think you're entering into a much larger and different topic than we're talking about. So we're going to thank the three gentlemen for their comments this morning and afternoon, and I'm sure we will take advantage of your offers. And now Michael Endicott is here as our last witness this morning. We will take public testimony after Mr. Endicott briefly. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Michael Endicott with Sierra Club, California. And gentlemen of the panel, thank you very much for having this hearing. I think already in some ways, while we've been discussing some smaller pictures, or my role here is to talk about an immediate smaller picture crisis related to the Department of Fish and Game's funding in particular, and the crisis that creates with respect to CEQA. There's been so much discussion of some of the bigger picture that I hope I can just take a couple of minutes to look at that as well, or put it into that context. But in particular, we have been struggling to cooperate, to try and talk about these issues that we've seen for a long time in timber harvest plans as part of the discussions about what do we do next, in the context also of crashing fisheries. The hearing on coho, for instance, showed the difficulties that if you don't have adequate review, if you're not keeping track of the cumulative impacts at the time that they're occurring, then you get these boom and bust cycles in nature as well as the economic boom and bust cycles of forestry. So part of the packet has a letter from us to the Secretary of Resources, along with the Center for Biological Diversity, some of the groups from up in the High Sierras, including Ebbets Pass Forest Watch and the Sierra Environmental Resource Center, the California Sports Fishing Protection Alliance, and the Federation of Fly Fishermen, saying that if the funding, the minimal funding of $1.5 million isn't restored to the Department of Fish and Game right now for Timber Harvest Plan review, there is so little fig leaf of cover that we're doing CEQA functional equivalency reviews and interdepartmental collaboration that this would throw into question the entire certification of the program. So we're glad that you're looking at these issues. We're glad that you're considering the role of fees, but this is a really important part to do. So in the big picture context, try to be as briefly as possible, is to remember that the purpose of CEQA is to make sure that you have a very accurate project description. It is also that you have to identify the potential significant impacts that are going to occur from your activity on private land, which also affect public trust. You have to look at potential mitigations, and then you have to look at potential alternatives. What CEQA does, and what the functional equivalency of the Timber Harvest Plan program is supposed to assure, is transparency, accountability, and a full assessment of the cumulative impacts. And that's looking at cumulative impacts of multiple puzzle pieces, as I'll get to. We need that functional equivalence to ensure that we have a resilient and sustainable forest for prolonged economic and environmental health. We see a boom and bust cycle, and jobs are important. Indeed, our members need jobs too, and they live in the area as well and are affected by that and have family members in the forest industry. But many of the factors that are really affecting the boom and bust cycle and how many mills are being closed are private business decisions that are also compounded by the bank turmoil that we've seen and the mortgage speculation and manipulations that has led to a giant oversupply of housing on the market. So you're trying to write a law that takes into account both nature's roles and nature's laws and make sure that you actually have the fundamental components of CEQA still in place. Department of Fish and Game has gone from 34 PYs to 9 people for the entire state. And they're admitting that now they can't look at some of the key areas where clear cutting goes on in the High Sierras. Now, we're not here to talk about the differences between kinds of forest harvest practices. What we're looking at is saying, how do you maintain the purposes of CEQA so that we can assure that transparency, accountability, and the assessment of the cumulative impacts? These plans actually we have looked at we've talked about issues of how do you expand the plans and that there are ways of doing it, as you've heard earlier today already. We even had a law 3 years ago to allow the plans to be extended precisely because of the economic downturn in the market that people couldn't have anticipated. When you put the plan in is when it triggers the beginning of the plan. But the lens of people's review, having the Regional Water Quality Control Board look at their issue, the Department of Fish and Game look at their issue, is absolutely critical. The Department of Fish and Game has independent responsibility for the conservation, protection, and management of fish, wildlife, and plants to make sure that we have sustainable populations. They also have a very important public trust function. And even though that inures to the benefit of all of the people, it's also the impacts are because of the impacts of the specific business on that public trust. And that public trust relates to the fish and wildlife resources that are held in trust for the entire people of California. The reviews are critical. And there's a basic reason for these review and compliance, and why when you start talking about, in one way, one-stop shopping or one-time initial review, that we have to actually remember what is the resource that we're dealing with here. There are certain specific program challenges when you start to look into it, and that happens, and why you need interim reviews, because this is a dynamic environment. The longer you make the Timber Harvest Plan, the more important it is to have boots on the ground of our agencies, excuse me for leaning in too far, of our agencies to be able to go out and do periodic reviews. The number of reviews you might need in an interim for a longer Timber Harvest Plan is going to be very critical, because you can have changed circumstances in that same Timber Harvest Plan area. You can have changed circumstances on the same ownership area. You can have changed circumstances in the surrounding ownerships. All of these are sliding pieces of the puzzle that the owner of a timber harvest plan, even if he has one already approved, might decide to harvest or not at a given time. When we're in a more static city environment, the public can see what's changing and what isn't changing. But here in the forested areas, we really have to over-rely on our agencies to actually carry out their duty, to have the resources to carry out that duty, and have the expertise to carry out that duty. In addition, when you were talking about what the statutory changes that we've had, yes, some of those have burdens that we put onto these, but they were usually done because they were as the result of somewhere where the CEQA equivalency wasn't working. And so we noticed this is what we need to do. Some of it was to try and provide efficiency and have the lead agency have more of a clear direction as to what it was supposed to provide. But these changed circumstances can be due to other activities, including conversion of the land, as has been mentioned here. We now have sort of a great rush to go into biomass. As we sit there and realize what is the data we're collecting to understand what is happening and where that biomass is going to come from in the forest, we realize that we don't have enough information yet. If it's carried well in CEQA or as the functional equivalent, that will inform all of these programs, which will help benefit those programs and implementation of that and our ability to trust those. Even fire management, about what's happening on the ground, depends somewhat on the timber harvest plans. It helps they cross-fertilize each other. But statutory changes, also happen because we have the Climate Action Reserve. And right now we're looking for initial compliance in offset markets to be 80% to come from our forested lands. So historically we watched the environment boom and bust. The salmon populations crash, which left many boats sitting at the dock, both sports fishermen's and also commercial fishermen's. That's just one example. Owls were another issue that were briefly brought up here. We have tried to work at ways to say, okay, let's build the toolbox for cumulative impacts. Assemblymember Chesbro's bill, AB 380, is one example of something that we actually got all the way to the governor before under the previous governor, and it was vetoed, unfortunately, and right now it's stuck at the moment. But if we can build those blocks together, that can help inform this conversation about how we can make things more efficient. There also could be ways of doing improved electronic filing, which would help the agency comply, but not only that, help the public have understanding and trust in what's going on. And if you actually have the timber harvest plans, connected to the geographic sense, that could lead to some improvements. So the important issue to remember right now, there is a critical crisis right now in that the Department of Fish and Game actually has suffered now, even though the legislature tried to provide a budget of $1.5 million for them to keep this fig leaf of review, is we need to get that back. That's the first step in this process, because without that, we really can't work on the other issues. In some ways, it's hard to understand how the solution to assuring better THP review, as agencies continue to face severe budget cuts, personnel cuts, and loss of expertise, is to make them bigger and more complex, make them last longer, make them fewer on-site agency reviews in the field. The forests are the lungs of the earth. The forests provide jobs, but they also provide critical habitat for resiliency and sustainability. The forests provide water for millions of people, both in filtering it and trapping snowpack on the ground to try and spread out how fast it melts. And it provides breeding areas for important commercial as well as hunting species. The forests also are the fuel for and the protection from our fires. We can look for ways for more efficiency and coordination in the Sierra Club and others. We're all happy to work on that arrangement. The devil is in the details. You want to make sure that as you try and change one thing, you're not forgetting about the other responsibilities under other statutory sections that we can actually already leverage, and that also a good THP plan would actually leverage into, particularly as you're looking to a programmatic type EIR process. But the most important thing that we can't lose sight, I hope today, is that we need to get the funding for the Department of Fish and Game restored by the executive branch in some fashion or another. Now, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Endicott. And you answered the question I was going to ask you about the willingness, and you can only speak for your own organization, I suppose, to participate if we have further discussions. You said you were open and willing to do that, so I appreciate that. That offer, and I hope it extends to the other organizations as well.
It does. And of course, that's one of the problems, though, is fixing one part of the block, and then how do you expand it so fast that you can overburden the system and lead to the unintended consequences in some ways. And so we have to be careful about how we sit down and discuss it. So we appreciate your committee looking into it. You know, Assemblymember Chesbro and others will be watching this, as well as Senator Pavley. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Endicott?
Thank you, Mr. Endicott. Do you see, though, at the far end of this discussion, that we can find a way to entrust for one-stop shopping. If the needs, the concerns by the other agencies are met and monitored so that we can get this efficiency and this streamlining we talk about, because we don't want to have to come back and have a crisis each time for funding in a state that doesn't look like it's getting out of this economic mess anytime soon. And you mentioned the $1.5 million that was coming up short for Fish and Game. If we had this streamlined process that doesn't leave any of these priorities behind, don't you agree we could eventually get to that point?
I think the biggest problem, one-stop shopping. Let me say in principle, the broad program and the direction of your discussion that I've heard you say today, yes, there can be improvements from our perspective too, as members of the public and as people who live up in the areas that care about these issues and try and monitor these timber harvest plans. If you get the information into a place at one time where everybody can use it and can verify it, which is the fundamental purpose of CEQA, so that we all know what is the project and how is the project going to be reviewed, and how do you make sure that the mitigations are actually happening, so that we can all see that, and how do you ensure ongoing monitoring in the field, that there's adequate basis for doing that. That's critical, because without enforcement, what happens is things get delayed until they hit a crisis, and we detect them downstream when the problem was upstream. And that upstream crisis can affect not only the person who wasn't really doing what they had to do or didn't notice some other changed circumstances, but it affects the other timber harvest plan operators down below it. So it's in everybody's interest to have a place where the data is collected in a way that is utilizable and verifiable. So my hesitancy that you're hearing in my voice to going to one-stop shopping is assuring that the verifiability is actually really happening after the fact, that you're doing these reviews. You can't just, if you just make a huge 20-year timber harvest plan, you have to build it off properly, because you change circumstances that can happen, like I said, from so many different forces and factors and that are decisions outside of it. So you need to be able to verify it. So yes, I think that there's significant improvements that can be made in the coordination of these agencies and stuff, but we need to make sure we maintain the expertise on the ground.
I agree. I think that's an expected thing by the industry as an ongoing, that someone is verifying and doing spot checks. And so I don't know that that's a hurdle we can't overcome. Real quick on the piece there, the $1.5 million, where there was a kind of a late effort to fund that in Fish and Game. Are you speaking the one where it was going to be a shift from fishing license fees towards timber harvest checks?
Well, it was a one-time sort of from the hatcheries and inland fisheries fund, not from the trout heritage fund, but from that portion. It was a small part of what they have actually in the budget right now. It's a special fund versus a general fund, which is why we were looking there. It does affect the same kind of species that are affected by forestry, and it was to try and say we need this. We're now going to go 3 years, 4 years without that kind of review, and we watch the number of Fish and Game folks that are being assigned to the program, come down and down and down. And that was why we said, look, here, and the legislature was very helpful in putting it forward and recognizing that this was out of a special fund. And it does affect, though, the fishermen. We have the Fly Fishermen's Association with us and the California Sports Fishermen folks, because they also understand the connection between that. And it wasn't to say this was to become the permanent way to do it. We would disagree with that. We want it actually to be on the folks that are actually having the biggest impact and causing the issue that you need to do.
Yeah, we saw that in Budget Committee, and although I understand maybe the dire need, but I thought it was setting a very dangerous precedent, and certainly was breaking the trust that people would have of where these funds are, supposed to be, as opposed to a temporary shift or like that. So I think that was a very, respectfully said, but a polarizing way to do that. We need to find other ways that keep the trust of where money was originally supposed to be and not shifted into that, because I think that was pretty problematic for the fishermen. So,
if I may, through the chair, just one quick response to that.
Quick.
But that's why we did talk sort of to the fishermen about it too. That's why we were really clear that this was a one-time event. We originally got under Governor Schwarzenegger. It was a preservation of a general fund aspect of it originally in the budget, all the way up until the very last moment. And the reason for this is that because there is the connection between the fisheries, and the fisheries are facing a critical crisis. But we were really clear that we didn't even consider this to be something that we would even consider as a long-term solution. And the whole purpose of that fund is actually to try and restore the populations that have been suffering from the timber harvest plan practices and conversion practices, et cetera. So it was to preserve the fisheries. So there was a connection in our mind. It wasn't meant to try and do anything underhanded. It was above board. It was in all of the budget processes. But that's why we saw the connection and said yes for this 1 year, because right now we have nothing. And so the challenge here in the letter that we delivered to the Secretary of Resources is that now, we're going to have to challenge the functional equivalency of the program if we can't get actually this stuff paid for.
I think we better
Thank you.
leave it there.
Appreciate.
Thank you, Mr. Endicott. As I indicated earlier, we will accept any public testimony. I think Mr. Bright wanted to speak. We'll entertain that briefly. Okay, come on this direction if you want to speak.
Mr. Chair and members, I'm Luke Bright with Forest Forever. A lot of things that Mr. Endicott said are things that we agree with as an organization. I just want to add this idea. I want to go back to the original, the original intent of the Forest Practice Act, and point out that the industry asked the legislature for a way around the CEQA requirement because of the time it took. And so the functional equivalent was implemented at that time. And over the years, going back at least 8 or 9 years, we have had more and more problems. The immediate problem, the $1.5 million that was taken out of the budget, is the latest hit on that. But before that even happened, we were seeing the number of people, scientists, that were in the field reviewing timber harvest plans being cut way back. So I just want to remind us all that the functional equivalent of CEQA is supposed to be a complete CEQA review under expedited conditions. And it is not at this point, and it is further and further away from it. So we would ask, we appreciate, Mr. Dickinson, your your efforts to get at the bottom of this, and we hope to continue working with you and other members that are interested in a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bright. Okay.
Vern Gehring with the California Native Plant Society. Thank you very much for giving me a couple of minutes to speak. Thank you, Chairman Dickinson, for your hearing on a very important issue. I've passed out a letter from the California Native Plant Society that I'm representing this morning so I can cut my comments shorter. But I want to speak just a little bit to just the simple issue of funding the Department of Fish and Game in this process. Not funding to other agencies that are involved, not their way they do their work or how they collaborate or don't collaborate, just the narrow issue of the funding. We have in California a tendency to create new laws and programs when existing ones don't seem to work quite right. We don't fix the ones that are on the books, we just create new ones. And I think that's a little bit of what is going on in this discussion of funding the THP review process. Fee-based funding for the Department of Fish and Game is not a theory or a concept for us to talk about. It's a legislative direction. In 1990, Governor Duke Machen signed legislation that stated the state's intent is to fund the Department of Fish and Game primarily through user fees, and that non-fee paying users should be identified and fees explored to cover the cost of the related program. That legislation also included and gave the Department of Fish and Game the authority to collect a fee from project proponents to cover its cost of conferring with public agencies, reviewing projects, recommending and monitoring mitigation, and enforcing wildlife protection measures. It's Section 711.4 in the Fish and Game Code. The fees are applied to projects reviewed under the California Environmental Quality Act and functional equivalent programs, including the THP review and approval process. The statute also states that the fees shall be annually reviewed and adjustments recommended to the legislature in an amount necessary to pay the full cost of the department's program as specified in the statute. Information from the department and from LAO reports that this fee currently only generates enough revenue to cover one THP related position in the Department of Fish and Game. when Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed the $1.5 million that's been discussed already today, it eliminated 16 positions. Our question was, why was so much general fund money being used in a fee-based program in the first place? To our knowledge, the department has never reviewed or recommended fee adjustments to cover its cost as required by the statute.
Can you conclude for us?
Yeah, it will. We recognize that it may not always be feasible or appropriate to cover all the costs by fees, or even maybe the current fee structure. But it's impossible to have an appropriate discussion about funding the department's aspect, at least, without the department's analysis of the cost. We urge this committee and the legislature to pursue using the existing authority in the law.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for staying late and keeping us all from lunch. I'm sorry I'm the one doing it. Addie Jacobson, Ebbets Pass Forest Watch. We're a grassroots, volunteer-based organization headquartered up in Calaveras County. And contrary to some of what some of you may hear, we do support logging that is consistent with the 1973 Forest Practice Act that allows logging while also protecting our public trust resources and local economies. And, you know, as that, we have looked at what's been set forth here today, and I just wanted to bring up a couple points on the alternatives that were set forth, because we think that they did bring up some points that haven't been fully developed into alternatives. And one, and I hate to throw more stuff back onto agencies, but it would be interesting to see how much of agency funding is spent on specific either companies or harvesting methods or however you could break it down in terms of beneficiary pays. To be equitable, if more time and energy is spent on certain types of plans, then it seems like the fees for those plans ought to be higher than for other ones. And in our area, you know, most of our timber harvest planning is intensive harvesting done by Sierra Pacific Industries, and we believe that generates a lot of review. We know it generates a lot of comments. It generates time and energy set forth on plans, and so it seems that perhaps those plans that cause the most agency effort ought to be paying more. We would probably be willing to posit that the plans set forth by Collins Pine Company out of Plumas County generate very little comment and very limited review. And probably at this point, the comments and review on the Humboldt Redwood and Mendocino Redwood plants might be the same. We know that they do. You know, from sitting at Board of Forestry for 11 years, I know that Humboldt Redwood is spending a lot of time with agency, as they said, developing HCPs and long-term protective processes. But that's different than looking at the plan as it comes in. And so we would ask that maybe some alternatives be devised that take into consideration those aspects I've just brought up. Because we believe that the intensive plans cost the state more, even down to the point that since that 2004 Little Hoover Commission report on timber harvest plans, nothing's been done on the appeal process, even though that was something that they asked be done immediately. And the only way we have to appeal an approved plan that we believe we put in legitimate comments about is to file lawsuits. So a lot of Attorney General costs get taken into a venue they shouldn't be.
Okay.
And let me just say this, that we believe that the intensive logging is done by larger firms who are able to absorb the larger costs. They provide less jobs. The type of equipment they use can have one person take the work that 10 to 15 people used to do. And this lessens our local revenue of people having jobs. So we thank you. We're part of other collaborative groups working to help people in our area, and we would be happy to be part of any future discussions that take place. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Or, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Catherine Moore. I'm from Central Coast Forest Association. I own 160 acres in Santa Cruz County. And I'm one of those people wondering, why am I still doing this? It has to do with the regulations. They really do give me a bellyache on a nightly basis. I've gone in my association. I talk to a lot of people, a lot of foresters. They ask, we've got a few questions from the ground level on cost savings. One of my people says, why do I need an archaeological review with each THP? All it is the same stuff under 3 inches more duff. Why don't we just have a little spot check that comes after you've got a baseline on a lot of things? Geological reports, the dirt's still the same dirt. Archaeological, a lot of botany surveys. If you haven't had a fire through, the trees are still pretty much in the same distribution a lot of times, the same species, all the rest of that. You send a field person in with a spot check. Tick, 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 tick. Okay, everything looks like it's recovering. Let's just get out of here. Rock and roll. Instead, we have to front the money to bring in an archaeologist to do a full review and then send that on to the agencies. You're not seeing that cost. You're not seeing me paying the archaeologist. You're not seeing me paying the geologist. You're not seeing me paying my forester to get all this assembled. $35,000 to $40,000 out of my pocket for at least a year before I get anything back in, and I'm not earning anything like $1 million a year. I got kids to put in school, stuff like that. It's got to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chairman Dickinson, Member Nielsen, staff. My name's Gary Reinerson. I'm with Green Diamond Resource Company. I'm a registered professional forester and also a former member of the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. We've been talking in abstract about it, but this is a timber harvesting plan. This is about 200 pages. It's a Chaparral timber harvesting plan that was prepared by our staff. It was approved this year. What I've given you as a handout is a diagram of all the men and women who are involved in the preparation through the approval process of this timber harvesting plan. If you start at the top, you can see the chief forester and the forestry technician and the registered professional forester who actually signed this plan and was the key author of the plan and its contents, but working across from left to right. These are the folks who are involved in the aquatic surveys, the owl surveyors, the terrestrial surveys, meaning things like the Pacific fisher and other fur-bearing animals, the botanical surveys. You can see the botanical crew that was assigned to this plan. The AHCP stands for Aquatic Habitat Conservation Plan Coordinator, who's responsible for all the monitoring during and post-harvest and all of the compliance with the Aquatic Habitat Conservation Plan that we have in agreement with the federal government. We also have a geologic review that occurred on this plan, road assessments to identify any roads that needed to be upgraded or repaired, a GIS specialist, and then the last is the licensed land surveyors. So this plan, this is an average plan. Our average plan cost us last year about $46,500 to prepare up through the approval process. In addition to that, there was about $4,600 worth of fees that we paid Water Quality and the Department of Fish and Game. Comparably, we have land in Washington State, a similar plan in Washington State, which is not nearly this thick. It's about $2,500 to $3,500. If the LAO's proposal was fully implemented, in addition to what the cost that we have, the $46,000 plus, would be an additional $90,000 based on the current proposal of fees. Just so we put that in perspective, that's a factor of 2 above what it costs us to do this.
Okay.
So with that, I would also like to thank Chesbrough for his recommendation, or Member Chesbrough for his recommendation to form a working group, and we'd be happy to participate.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
How many, besides the 2 gentlemen here, how many others wish to speak? We have 2? Okay, why don't you come forward? And you can take these chairs and...
Chairman Dickinson, my name is Bill Kai. I'm a California licensed forester, and I'm here representing California Licensed Foresters Association. And thank you for having the hearing. I think we've had a very rich discussion, and I think that it kind of illustrates to me as a professional forester the complexities of forestry and all the various working parts and the variables that go into it. In California, we do have we have millions of acres of what foresters would traditionally call good ground. We can grow trees on a world-class. We have basically temperate rainforests in some of our state, and we can really grow trees. Of course, there are other values to protect, but I would just simply say forests are a perpetual source of wealth, both economic and non-economic. My members have basically been riding this sled downhill for quite a while, not just since the recession hit. Our membership is down. Folks have had to give up and find other work or leave the state or what have you. But we're still here, a lot of us, and we still have trees out there growing because folks in this, and to respond to Mr. Nielsen, in this building, they can't pass a law to stop the trees from growing. And that's one thing I always tell my members when I hear frustration. And also, along the line of Mr. Nielsen's questioning, as far as what has changed, my sense is, and I've been doing this since the 70s, my sense is that my profession is actually on the increase of social license. I think we are gradually gaining in that area, having really taken some hits in an earlier era. The other thing is that we really are in different economic times now, and it's affecting all of us. So I think the time may actually be ripe, and I think this hearing is a good starting point for having some discussions, the work group concept. And I'll just leave you with the question, why can't California have a world-class, globally competitive forestry sector?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good news, I may lose my voice, so I'll be very quick. I'm Eric Carlson with the Associated California Loggers. Certainly many thanks to the legislators who are here and who came earlier today to give the attention to this very important social and economic issue in California. I wanted to make 3 points, if I could, fairly briefly. First, I represent the largely family-owned, multi-generational businesses that provide living wage jobs in the forested rural communities of the state. Our workers have very special skills, certified skills, and not only are we dwindling in our ranks, but we're aging in our ranks as we look to try to recruit people to take on these skills and carry forth in doing things that have not only to do with timber harvesting, but with biomass collection for alternative energy, with fire prevention, salvage cleanup, and certainly with mitigations of things done by a forest timber industry that is many, many, many years before the regulated one that's before you now. We think it's in the interest of California to maintain the infrastructure represented by the people I represent and the jobs that they bring to this industry. Number two, our members work closely within the Forest Practice Act rules and closely with the inspectors of state and federal agencies who carry out the rules. A number of my members have called me and talked about working in the woods, in the fields, with people who advise them from the state and federal agencies on what to do and how to do it better. These government officials actually help teach our logger certification courses, our pro logger courses. So we do try to work with them. And at the same time, we have to ask this question. It's all part of a regulatory scheme which makes California wood the most environmentally regulated wood in the world. And yet we import 80% from states where it's less regulated, countries where it's less regulated. We think you should be thinking about that in terms of the things discussed today. Finally, this was a very good hearing on costs and efficiencies. We don't want to take it too wide beyond its parameters. But I think you could also understand, if you just not about what things were discussed today, this was a hearing on rural poverty, unemployment rates far above the 12% of the rest of the state, 20, 30, 40%. This was a hearing on health. Many forested rural counties are the least healthy adult health counties in the state. Finally, it was a hearing on crime. As our regulated industry moves out, crime moves in, good people are being murdered, and people are afraid to go into certain woods in this state. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
My name is David Levy. I'm a registered professional forester. I work predominantly on very small landowners, anywhere from 3 acres to 20, 30, 40, maybe 100 acres. Over the last 30 years I've been a forester. I've seen plans change from 2 pages to 8 pages to over 100 pages has been suggested. Costs gone from $200 to $500 to $1,000 to $10,000. And most of all I do is answer questions and make minor detailed changes, and the landowner gets to do what he wanted to do in the first place after I finally go through a 3 to 6 month period to go through all the rigmarole that's presented. This has to be simplified, and it's a lot of time that's being spent. I refer to facetiously as a $10,000 paper duck. Looks like a duck, acts like a duck, is a duck. All we want to do is just log our properties and make it right. There used to be simple exemptions. They now have complicated a 3-acre exemption from the harvest plan. Used to be able to do it. Now you have to have a bona fide intent to log. are able to log without a harvest plan 100% of your trees, but you can't log 3 or 4 or 5, 10% of your trees because you don't qualify for that. So there should be some serious discussion about exemptions and possibly raise the exemptions from the review of a harvest plan to simplify the THP process of review by the CDF for very small plans that are 3 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres on those properties. They don't have water courses, don't have sensitive plants, don't have geology issues, and where a registered professional forester can certify under penalty of his perjury of his license that there is no problem, and if there is a problem, he's going to be in trouble. And there should be a plan for either minimum acres or minimum volume that doesn't have to go through the full review. That would take quite a bit of my plans away from things. Lastly, when they tell me I need to have a harvest plan when we have such a small little situation and we don't qualify for exemption, I've had many landowners who either decided that they weren't going to do a harvest plan or they weren't able to do it because of the cost.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Dave Bischel. I'm president of the California Forestry Association. We represent over 4 million acres of private forest owners and probably 95% of the primary manufacturers of wood products in this state. Our members are entirely privately held companies and family-owned businesses. Nearly all of our forest lands are owned by family entities who have found a niche and been able to operate in this state in spite of the difficult times and the difficult economic conditions in which we operate. But we do sit in a situation where our regulatory costs are running something in the range of $60 per thousand board feet. Our competitors to the north are $8 to $9 per thousand board feet. That difference alone allows operators from Oregon and Washington to access Southern California markets cheaper than we are. And we're selling a commodity. It is a product that it's the lowest cost person who has the highest general opportunity. And in this case, we're no longer the lowest cost producers to our own market. So we are very certain from an economic perspective, a need to take a look at this, and very much appreciate your committee shining a light on this and offer to participate fully in the process that that you've been talking about here today to see how we can make this system achieve the environmental objectives that we all agree we want, and at the same time allow us to be competitive in a very competitive world environment. There are just a couple of things I wanted to add. I do have the most recent, if you could, Mr. Nielsen, thank you, data about the timber harvest. There seems to be some confusion about what is and isn't the facts, and certainly we have seen between 1997 and 2010 a reduction from over 1,000 timber harvest plans approved to just over 200 approved. We have seen timber harvest drop from over 2 billion board feet to about 1 billion board feet per year. And we have seen the acreage harvested, and this is the acreage in approved timber harvest plans, drop from about 225,000 acres a year to about 88,000 acres a year, which is about a 65% drop. So all of that in the context of losing over half of our primary manufacturers, and every million board feet of timber harvested in the state produces a minimum of 6 direct jobs and 12 indirect jobs. And certainly I would agree with your first assessment about this is a zero net game, but for every job that is lost in the industry because of increased regulatory costs, that leads to a direct loss of 1 to 6 jobs and double that in indirect jobs in these rural communities. So we ask that you look at that issue very closely. I also would like to give you a copy of our letter in response to CBDs, which
okay, and then can you conclude, Mr.
Yes, which identifies the fact that you do not, and will not lose your certification as a regulatory program simply because budget cuts occurred. The Department of Fish and Game has the full responsibility as a trustee agency to allocate their resources in the appropriate place. We didn't support that budget cut, but we certainly support working with them to make the system better.
I'm sure that's a discussion that's going to go on, and it's within its own parameters. Thank you very much for your comments. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak? Seeing no one, this is obviously a hearing which is in some respects a continuation of a long-standing and sometimes contentious debate that's gone on for a number of years. We're looking at a particular aspect of it this morning, but the issue is an important one, as I said at the outset, in a very financially constrained environment. It calls on all of us to re-examine our approaches and our responsibilities, our rightful role, not just with respect to governmental employment or private employment in a particular industry, but with respect to the interests of all Californians. I appreciate Chairman Chesborough's suggestion of thinking about a working group. It's a topic I'll explore with him after this hearing. And I also appreciate the offers of those who've spoken this morning about being willing to participate in an ongoing effort to find the right place to land in the interest of all. So with that, thank you all for being here, and this hearing is adjourned.